Just really quickly about who's on the stage with us here today. To my left here, we have Thelma Kaliu from Malawi. Woo! There we go, some supporters in the house, I love it. Alumni from 2019, she's the co-founder of GenHub Malawi and works at the intersection of feminist practice, research, policy, and technology. Her work has supported more than 25,000 adolescent girls and strengthened access to justice for hundreds of gender-based violence survivors across Eastern and Southern Africa. Welcome, Thelma. And to her left, we have Mohamed Altamash Khan, a guest alumnus from India, 2022 alumnus. Altamash is a gender trainer and program manager, working extensively with young men and masculinities. In his work, he's reached more than 50,000 young people and collaborated with state governments on gender curricula. His guest final assignment evolved into a widely used manual on transforming masculinities in India. Welcome, Altamash. And to his left, we have Aarti Lila from Pakistan. She's a development practitioner working at the intersection of gender, climate adaptation, and mitigation. She currently leads gender-responsive monitoring and evaluation at the Engro Foundation and has trained more than 25,000 women and girls on gender mainstreaming and leadership. Welcome to you. And finally, a man that requires no further introductions is Yeshiwas over here. Give him a hand again. So, where to begin? I think that it would be very prudent to start talking about challenges, like I mentioned before, because, like you mentioned, Yeshi, in your keynote, especially the last couple of years have been incredibly difficult for gender equality. Don't get me wrong; it's always been difficult, but like something has happened in the last year or two that I think we all recognize. So I think I would like to start just asking, what is it that has happened in the last year and how have you responded to something like this? I think, rather than you putting your hands up, I'll just point out who needs to answer. Thelma, let's start with you. So you work in gender-based violence prevention and response, and I know that you lead an organization that really depends on sustained funding. So can you maybe tell us a bit about how things have changed in the last year and how you've responded to that?
Okay, yeah. Good afternoon, and thank you for having me today. So I think when I left GEST and then going back to the field to work in gender-based violence, we were met with COVID. And the unfortunate part was that there was an increase of gender-based violence cases in Malawi, but we worked towards that. But what is happening currently is something that we have never experienced before. So Malawi, to those of you that don't know, it's in the Eastern and Southern Africa, which is one of the third poorest countries. So which means state funding towards gender-based violence is not a state priority, which is quite unfortunate. We have spent the last 10 years advocating for that, but we have largely dependent on donor funding, of which at this point in time, we have a lot of girls that are suffering from the erosion of gender-based violence that is happening now. So at an organizational level where I lead gender-based violence response at a community level, one thing that we're trying to do, it's not really working, but what we're trying to do is to move from individualistic approaches to respond to gender-based violence. So we used to have something which we used to call Survivor Fund, where we would support a survivor to access services. These are health services or psychosocial support. But currently we're moving from that. We are investing in seed capital for women-led groups that can generate income and still support the survivor so that it's sustainable and prolonged. And we have also making it a key that we need to digitalize and monitor how these funds are being circulated within the community. And we are solely focusing on the communities with feminist-led groups that are within our communities. So this is something that is working, but we're still continuously lobbying for the government to use our taxes to also support social protection. That's what I can say.
Right. So it sounds like this is an ongoing challenge, especially since let's just say it out loud, like things like USAID, things like that have been like massively scaled back in the last couple of years, which means that you have to like work even harder for the few funds there are. I'm wondering if you could pass the microphone to Altamash, because I want to hear. Now, this was in gender-based violence prevention, but like you work specifically in educating and engaging young men and boys. Like, how does this landscape look where you are?
Yeah, I think just to extend what Thelma just mentioned, I think especially in my work in India, it has been twofold. Where on one hand, we have been seeing that there has been that pouring of money, there has been some investment coming in terms of including gender in your work. But the problem has been that it has been more sort of performative. I think the focus has been that you can include it. There has been gender has been seen as a governance concern, if I may call it. But at the same time, it is just, as I said, just at the level of performance. And at times, you also feel that performance is incentivized. So if you are an organization who are just, you're just working at the superficial level and you're not really challenging the gender norms or the power hierarchy, or you're not really challenging the state order, you're all good. You're all good to go. But the moment you sort of try to expand, you try to go within the layers, there might be some backlash from the state, things like fund cuts, things like whether your ability to get foreign funding gets really sort of impacted. And other thing that has really come forward, especially in context to India, and when I was thinking, I think it's a global concern as well, where things like that, there is also this, especially by the political class, to talk about some kind of civilizational revival and this going to the glorious past. And what that has done is, in some ways, try to focus on, and the moment you talk about glorious past, there is this thing about sort of going back to those essentialist ideas of gender, looking at masculinity in terms of strength and protection, and looking at queer and non-normative identities as, not significant to the country's identity. So I think there has been that contradiction in terms of state trying to sort of talk about gender, but at the same time also, bringing these ideas as well, which are...
Exactly. I wanna hold on to what you're talking about here. This sense of, I think every gender practitioner out there will recognize this idea of performativity versus substance. Right, when it comes to politics and engagement with gender equality. If you pass the microphone to Aarti, because Aarti, you work in, I think it is on, yeah, but you work in monitoring and evaluation, which I think if anywhere is like where you have to pick up on whether things are working, whether things are having impact or not. Could you maybe reflect a bit on, or give us a couple of examples of, in your field of work, where do you see like this paradox between substantive gender equality and when it's just sort of like paying lip service to gender equality?
Thank you for the question, Thomas. So I think one of the clearest warning signs is that when gender becomes like a mandatory paragraph in a proposal instead of that meaningful shift in practice. So in terms of monitoring and evaluation, I think those red flags would be when you're focusing a lot on the outputs alone. So like how many people are reached, how many women and girls were beneficiaries in your program, like how many kits were distributed, instead of the outcomes, which are longer sustained over time. And how do you like kind of see those kind of changes over time? Because in those proposal language, which also there are a lot of problematic things in it. So first, like Global North always homogenizes Global South as one category. And a lot of these language does not help, because at the end of the day, when you talk about gender sensitive implementation, it really sort of sees like a disconnect between the language of the proposal and what's sort of needs in the community. I have a really good example from the floods of 2022 in Pakistan. I was involved in one of the flood relief programs there, and as we know through research that women and girls are marginally affected and disproportionately affected through the times in floods and disasters. So a lot of people, there was a lot of global pressure during that time, and donors were reaching out to us left and right because they just wanted to commit money to some or the other project. Mm-hmm. And now the problem is that they wanted to commit in climate adaptation and not mitigation, which is climate adaptation is more short term, and relief oriented, so not necessarily how to rehabilitate back the communities. And one of the things that happened was they themselves identified menstrual needs in disasters, which is a very important need, but they decided themselves that how they wanted to go about it. So they invested into it, but at the end of it, that when they committed and allocated funds for menstrual products, two things happened. One, that the rural communities in Pakistan, women did not know how to use those sanitary products because they only used cloth. So there was no ecosystem around the engagement and education of using such products. And second thing that happened, that it did not even reach a lot of women because it was given, when the ration and sanitary products are given to male members of the family, because it's a camp situation, it did not even reach the women there. So.
Right, so here you have like an example of like donors not just being out to tick the box of gender equality, which is clearly what they wanted to do, like throwing all this money into short-term relief, but at the same time they completely, what you could say, completely misunderstood the context in which they were trying to set an agenda in.
While on paper it looks that they achieved,
exactly.
It papers on looks it perfect because you allocated funds for menstrual needs in disasters. You did distribute kits, but at the end of the day, it did not really translate into agency power or access to those things.
Right, and I'd love to pursue you down the road about compliance and reporting and that whole political landscape. But I think I want to hold on to this idea of global North actors misunderstanding context, because I know, Thelma, this is a pet peeve of yours. So I'm wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, I think in the last years we have been in a polycrisis, and I think one of the key things that you have really pointed out is the lack of understanding on the context, which also goes hand in hand with the lack of understanding of the population, the demographic itself, and especially speaking of the majority South. I think we have come to understand that all women and girls in the majority South, be it in Asia, in Africa, or wherever, are vulnerable. But I beg to differ that, especially us as scholars, we need to start questioning the parameters that are only defining us from a single identity that we are vulnerable. I would also want to give an example of the floods as well. I was one of the key people conducting a rapid gender assessment, which is usually done in conflict or in a humanitarian setting. And then this was one of the most devastating floods in Malawi, which communities really took initiative to take something on their own. There was an area that we went to, there was no aid for 2 weeks, but then there was a group of women that managed to gather themselves, created a shelter, and started treating people by the few resources that they had. And then when I wrote this in the report and then presented it to the authorities, they said this is not eligible. Which organization enabled them to do that? So it's like we're always viewed that we are waiting for a savior to come, which is in most of the case, it's like the legitimate white savior or a legitimate Red Cross, Médecins Sans Frontières, and all these organizations, but we are equally capable. So the danger of a single side story, as Chimamanda has said, these identities, we need to start denying them. It's not that we want to deny that we're vulnerable, no, but we have to move beyond the dichotomy of there's a donor and there's a recipient, or there is a vulnerable person or a resilient person. We are equally capable, and we need to move around the temporal spaces that we can also equally occupy and move beyond the agency that is defined in the West, but rather occupy the agencies that we already have and we can also teach the West.
Exactly. And applause, by the way. Thank you. And no, but I think Thelma and everyone in here that those power dynamics between global North donors, global South recipients, like that kind of binary, it's like it's something that's both awkward and uncomfortable to talk about, I think. And I think it is important that we allow ourselves sometimes to sit in that kind of discomfort and actually have the conversation. I want to hold on to that, the idea of this power dynamic, because Yeshi, you're in research. So, and I know that especially in in global research, there is like a lot of, in terms of power dynamics, there's a lot of ideas about whose research is considered legitimate, right? Or not? Do you understand where I'm going?
Definitely.
I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
When it comes to research, there is this kind of a divided kind of the global north as a center of knowledge and knowledge production, and the global south as a site of or object of study, which also implicates how the experts and the researchers are positioned in that kind of knowledge production system, and often the global knowledge scholars have they have more or better access to funding, right. And at the same time they are also presented as international and global experts, while researchers and experts from the global south are often framed and represented as kind of local experts or regional experts, which somehow, to some extent, it's important so that when it comes to our local context, sometimes if you are from the external and Western institutions, somehow your ideas and arguments might be seen in a very negative way. Your arguments might be seen as something externally influenced and kind of external kind of imposition on the state and the political system. But in terms of a general knowledge production, that's a major kind of challenge when it comes to research. And the program like GRÓ GEST, for example, could be kind of a way to kind of address that kind of power asymmetry. Personally, I'm from the global south, but spend almost much of my PhD research here. So I'm kind of playing that kind of dual identity and getting the resource and the space, from the global north, but also representing the global south. So that's why actually I like about GEST in terms of the kind of addressing that kind of power asymmetry.
Sure. Yeah. But I'm wondering, how do you negotiate that differential, if I may ask?
Well, if you talk about negotiation, I would prefer to reflect from two kind of dimensions. Negotiation between experts, between the global north and global south experts, and negotiation within the global south itself. And maybe the second one might be somehow kind of related to my experience. When I go to field work, when I did my fieldwork research, I had to negotiate to get access to the field, data. Yeah. Sometimes I have to kind of remove some of my questions, or sometimes I have to remove some of my terminologies. For example, it's very difficult to use the term feminism when you go to research, because it has some kind of, externally imposed kind of terminology. That does not necessarily mean compromising my findings and analysis, but it's a way of it's a strategic kind of communication, so that your findings can be communicated in a way the state officials can kind of understand or accept to some extent.
Right. So, sure.
To that negotiation, especially within our context, and I think everybody sitting here working within the field would agree that negotiation is not just one of like incidental, but rather it's very central to the work that we do, right? And in terms of those negotiation would look like what as you rightly said, what gets included, what gets maybe softened, what gets omitted at times, right? Because maybe an example, if I may add, I was working with one of the state government, wherein I was trying to develop a curriculum for gender and masculinity for year 9 to 12. And they sort of invited me and they said, okay, you've got these many days, you have to write and submit it. And I wrote and submitted it. And 3 days into it, I get a call from the principal secretary saying that you have used words like sex, sexuality, patriarchy. You can't be using those, right? So now, in terms of my own understanding, my feminist scholarship sort of taught me that this was a way of censorship, and the words in itself hold power, right? So I have to use those words, those terminologies, because it can also be a way of sort of some kind of erasure, right? You don't use patriarchy, you say that patriarchy does not exist. So it was in that moment a negotiation, whether do I give up this opportunity of sort of, do I discard this whole project, or do I change the language, or do I sort of then maybe work collaboratively with some agents and try to sort of relook at some of the words, and that's what I did, right? So negotiation at that point meant that I collaborated with the local teachers who were eventually going to teach that curriculum, and said that, okay, instead of patriarchy, can we sort of explain it, like maybe in terms of power, in terms of how land is owned or how land gets transferred. So not using the word, but at the same time sort of making sure that that conversation persists.
Right. So in that sense, like the idea of negotiating, I feel like that is such it's such a central part of the work we do. Like, because nothing is ever accepted at face value when you're in gender equality. Whenever you bring up, when you state an obvious fact, it's almost always contested, and you have to negotiate how much, you know, a certain intervention has a right to be intervened, right? But I'm wondering, Aarti, like if you could speak a little bit to, because again, in monitoring evaluation where you work, I'm imagining that this idea of like negotiating and finding space for like how much gender and gender equality can take up is an issue.
For sure.
Okay.
To say the least. I think it's twofold. So one is that the constant struggle is to negotiate with international donors and to understand that monitoring is important, but evaluation and learning, because now they're calling it MEL, so learning from the past and the present and then looking at future. So the struggle is to constantly encourage and push that it's not only the day-to-day monitoring of indicators that have been set in project and design and implementation is important, but the evaluation of it, which is not linear, it does not happen overnight, it takes a long time. The behavioral change and attitude shifts, they take a while to change, show, disrupt, all of those things. So it's important, and it's constantly just negotiating that with them, that it's important to invest in evaluation, because the budget cuts when they don't, and evaluation is expensive as well, because when impact measurements happen for a study over time, it requires funding. Mm-hmm. And if there is no funding kept in the beginning of the project, it's hard to then look at it. And the second is, in my organization, I'm not quite young anymore, but in terms of the senior leadership and people who are making the decisions at the end of project cycles, it's hard, to say the least, to bring them all on one table, because it's important to look that the project aim should be one, but somehow the priorities along the way have to be kind of talked about day in, day out, sit at the table, making sure they're not talking over each other, making sure those voices in those spaces are also heard, because the communities are sitting, the leadership who's giving out the money, they are sitting, then we as foundation people are sitting who is negotiating. So it feels like Sarah Ahmed rightly said that it's a killjoy moment for us, right, where I have to be that person and say that, okay, it has to be beyond outputs. Outcomes need to be looked at.
Right. So not, I really sense that like having to negotiate gender equality is really central to everyone's work here. So, but I'm afraid also we're running out of time. So Thelma, here towards the end, super quickly in under 30 seconds. Do you find you have to negotiate a lot?
Yes.
Yes.
All the time. And I think I would want to reflect to what I learned from Giti. I never forget this on redefining the problem. I think this is one thing that is really working in my renegotiating in most of the spaces, because most of the times when we're writing proposals, it's always the problem is child marriages. You know, a lot of young girls are getting married because of child marriages. The culture in Malawi is bad, but I think I've found a way in like just negotiating within the state actors, within the traditional leaders, and then also within the service providers. And the negotiation is not going to them to say the problem is we have child marriage, is what do you think? So recreating, designing spaces and recreating the spaces that go beyond just accepting a definition of the problem that you have been given is actually the good starting point. And beyond baseline and endline, beyond always writing reports against the indicators, we need to do feasibility studies that we can both co-create and co-end the projects that we're working on.
All right, thank you. So we're going to stop here. I could continue this all day, but you know we are on a schedule. So I think thank you so much to the panel. Big round of applause.